Chapter 11, Cells. This chapter reviews MicroStation cells. The topics include cells, cell libraries, the FDOT menu cell options, dropping cells. I like to refer to cells as being the clip art of the CAD world. They are pre-drawn symbols, objects, or patterns that you can place over and over again from a cell library. They're all stored in a cell library. What a cell library is actually just a DGN file that has multiple models. Each of those models is a cell and has had the can be placed as a cell attribute checked on the model properties. That makes it a cell, and then of course it is saved as a .cel file instead of a .dgn, but ultimately it's just a DGN file. And when coupled with the FDOT-SS4 software and these cell search paths, it allows you to then place these objects, patterns, and designs as cells, like clip art, over and over again. So as I mentioned, cell libraries are a type of DGN library that ends with the .cel extension. I'm going to go ahead and step you through extemporaneously the different cell options that you do have in FDOT-SS4 and MicroStation. Note immediately that we have a Cell Apps menu on the FDOT-SS4 menu. The first item gives you access to the FDOT cell libraries, which all it does is actually just bring up the cell library dialog. You'll notice in the cell library dialog you do have a list of cell libraries that you can quickly attach. And these are all the standard FDOT-SS4 cell libraries that are listed in the cell search list for whatever discipline you're working in. Right now we're just in standard mode, and so that's going to include everything that you'd find doing roadway design or traffic plans. And then if you were to switch to right-of-way mode, you'd see a limited list of different cell libraries. And structures mode, same thing, limited list of different cell libraries. That cell list would also include any cell library that you place in the cell folder of your project. Let's take a look at this data set real quick. I'm going to the standard menu and selecting Explore Current Working Directory. There's a little trick for you. And now I'm in my current working directory. I'm going up a level. This would be the FPID number. You'll notice there's a cell folder. If we put a cell library in that cell folder, it will then be picked up by FDOT-SS4 MicroStation and listed in this quick search list of cell libraries. Just a neat little trick. So you can create your own custom cell libraries, and we will be doing that in this chapter. Let's take a real quick look at the dialog. At the top of the dialog, it tells us what cell library is attached. There's a couple of options here on the menu for creating a new cell library, attaching a file, which is attaching a cell library, attaching a folder, which means you could attach all of the cell libraries that live in a specific folder. You can detach and compress. This upgrade files to V8, you don't need to worry about that. That's a legacy option for updating V7 files. Hope too many of those don't exist anymore. You'll also notice there's a couple of checkboxes here. Display all cells in path is going to display all the cells in the MS cell list. That's not MS cellist, that's MS cell list. That's the variable that specifies the search paths for the cell libraries. That's to say the variable that populates this list. So if you were to check this box, which I'm not going to do, it's going to display all of the cells that exist in all of these libraries. Use shared cells. Don't check that. We don't want to use shared cells. They don't work well in the FDOT workflow. Shared cells is when you place one cell and then every other cell that you place of that same cell in your file is linked back to that original one. It used to be a good way to reduce file size. Now that we're not so concerned about that, or at least in terms of cells, we don't use that because it can cause problems with the FDOT workflow. And anytime you edit one of the shared cells, if you were to do something to it, it would affect all the other shared cells. So you don't want to do that. This is a list of actual cells that are in the cell library that we have attached. I currently have the landscape cell library attached, so it's a bunch of trees. You see the name, a description, the type and whether it has annotation scale applied to it. Cells can automatically be scaled by annotation scale. So if it's, for example, this is a pattern, concrete blocks, those will automatically be scaled based on annotation scale because that's a pattern that's going to be a pattern fill. And of course we'll talk about that in the next chapter, patterning. Otherwise, you'll notice stuff like trees are going to be placed at a 1-to-1 scale because they represent a physical object, whereas a pattern would represent symbolically a pattern because it's not going to display well if you print it out with every last brick at the size of an actual brick at a, say, 80 scale. There are 4 types of cells that can be active cells. This is, for all intents and purposes, a settings dialog, if you think of it that way. The placement cell is the cell that you just place like clip art. So you set an active cell for that. And anytime you go to the place cell tool, which is down here in the cell tools, which I'm going to open up as a toolbox. See, I've got a tree now, because that's my active placement cell. There's an active point cell. Make something else the active point cell. I realize it's kind of silly to use the landscape library, but it works to demonstrate the point. Point cell, right? Sorry. So the point cell is anytime you end up with a dialog that's going to place points, there may be an option to use a cell. And it's not going to refer to the placement cell as the active cell to use for placing points. It's going to look and see what you have set for your point cell. So you can place evergreen number 9 all you want, all over your plan. And then when you go to a point tool, it's going to be looking at the flower symbol. There's also an option to specify a terminator cell, and that's when you're going to be placing a terminator on the end of a leader line. It will place whatever is set for the terminator cell. And then the pattern cell. So when we get into patterning and it says, use cell, it's going to look to what you have set for the pattern cell. Like hey, that's a pattern cell. So now that's the pattern cell. Meanwhile, if I go back to place cell, it's still looking at the placement cell. So that is my clip art cell. That's my place a point when I'm importing coordinates or doing something like that. That's the terminator cell on the end of a line whenever I say put a terminator on the end of the line. And that's the pattern, so whenever I'm working in a pattern tool. So you can have 4 different types of cells set and ready to go, and you can be using different tools and not having to say, oh, well, wait, I left it on evergreen number 9 as my placement cell and I really want to place a pattern now. No, that cell is already set here. You've got your graded section set, so you're good to go. That way you can configure all of these tools with different cells and not have to keep coming back to the cell library dialog. Well, so I've talked a lot about placing cells, but I actually haven't placed a cell yet. So how do you place a cell? If you click the Place Cell tool, it's going to bring up the Place Cell dialog. Okay, it's going to give you the active cell name right here. This is going to populate with whatever it's set for in that cell dialog. If you have not set one, it'll be blank, and then you can click the Browse Cells icon. It'll bring up the cell library dialog. Now, you may not have any cell library attached. See, it's blank now, so I can go ahead and say, oh, let's attach. Well, I do like working in the landscape cell library, so let's use this attach landscape cell library. Okay, and I'm going to select, that's a good looking tree, as my placement cell. Now you see that's populated in the active cell portion of the dialog. Last time we used active angle to do something, we left it at 15. Let's bring our scale back to 1-to-1 because this is a 1-to-1 tree. We're placing this tree at the actual size that it is. Okay. A couple of notes about the different checkboxes. You don't necessarily need to know too much about them other than relative is going to put that tree on the active level. So if you ever notice that you're placing cells and they're coming in on the wrong level, not the level you expect them to be, check to make sure that relative checkbox isn't checked. You can choose to mirror the cell. Not sure if you can tell that that's mirrored. Now it's back to normal. That's horizontal. And just like the mirroring tool, you can select horizontal, vertical, and both. Interactive scale and rotate allows you to enter a data point and then scale the cell and then enter another data point and then rotate the cell. that is a way to place cells. Not the way that I'm going to demonstrate, but now you've seen that's how you can scale and rotate. And then of course you can set it with rotate only or scale only. Scale multi-line offsets, that's if your cell contains multi-lines, which it probably won't. Scale dimension values and annotations, and that's for cells that would contain annotations and dimension values. But right now we're just placing a tree, and I still have not placed that tree. That's how you place a tree. You enter a data point. You can, of course, snap to key points. You can use AccuDraw, just like we did when we placed that text and placed it relative to something. Here's my point. I hit O. I know I want to place it 10 feet from there, or I want to reset and do that again. I want to start there, and then I want to, snap to that, tap O, and go halfway to this line, but then I want to go divide by 2. So yeah, you can use AccuDraw and all the other tools with the Place Cell tool to place your cells. Another function we do have on the cell menu is the FDOT cell web pages. The FDOT cell web pages is a local web page, local to your machine, and it opens up in the CAD Pilot browser. This allows you to explore the different cell libraries and actually get previews of each cell on a page, so you can look at them and see what they look like rather than having to scroll through an entire cell library in the cell dialog. You can actually just come in here and look at what you're looking for. For example, you get the drainage library. You can see all the drainage structures. Geotechnical library, which is largely just patterns. You got your utilities library. So that way you can look at all the cells, and then if you want to place a cell, all you have to do is click on the image, and there's that troublesome fire hydrant again. Probably in the wrong location. That's how you place cells from the cell web pages. Other tools on the cells toolbar. We've got place active cell matrix, and that's going to place a matrix of whatever the active cell is. In this case, I did not have enough spacing to make that make sense. So let's go ahead and give it a spacing of 5 by 5. And you enter a data point, and it places a matrix of those cells. This is select and place cell, so I can select a cell that exists. It's kind of like a copy tool specifically for cells. Define cell origin is something we're going to be using when we create cells. Identify cell is going to populate the cell information down here in the bottom status bar. Place active terminator is going to place the active terminator on the end of a line that you click on. I do not currently have one. I can set one in the cell dialog. By the way, the cell dialog is available from the primary toolbar. If I hadn't mentioned that enough already, you can access it as a quick dialog or by clicking on it like that. Let's see, let's set an active terminator. Let's do something ridiculous. Let's make it a, well actually this perfectly serviceable arrow. Let's see if any scaling needs to happen. No, that looks great. Anytime I click on a end of a line, it's going to place an arrow. Now, we actually have terminator arrows. They're in the roadway cell library. So I'm going to go back and do this the right way. Let's attach the roadway cell library. Locate a, that's a good terminator arrow. Whoops, I made it the active cell. You don't want to do that. If you double click, it makes it the active cell. I'm going to make it the terminator cell. I'm going to make something else the active cell. There we are. So now you see I'm in place cell because it automatically activated that. Place active line terminator is going to place a terminator arrow when you click on a line. So it brings up this little dialog. We don't have a terminator specified, so we're going to select browse cells. It's going to go to this. Now, we don't want to double click on a cell because a double clicking on a cell is going to make it the placement cell. That's not what we want to do. So let's open up the roadway cell library. And this is not an exercise, this is me just monologuing. Find a perfectly serviceable terminator. Click on terminator. Notice we do not have an active placement cell, we just have a terminator. And there you go. Replace cells is used to replace a single or multiple cells in a model or to update cells in a model with the cell of the same name from the active cell library. So in other words, it's kind of a find and replace tool for cells, except without the find functionality. It's just replace. And then the final option is place cell index. We're not going to talk about this too much because it's not something we really use, but the place cell index tool is used to create and place a cell index. A cell index contains all of the models or cells in the active DGN file that are marked as can be placed as a cell. The cell index is stored in the active model and each cell is attached as a reference. After a cell has been placed, it can be edited. So that's a sort of a cell management tool. I did mention on the cell apps menu you can access the cell libraries and cell web pages. We have a cell counter, which will return information about how many cells and what types of cells are in your design file. There's a cell search tool. The cell search tool we are replacing pretty soon with a more robust cell search tool, but this allows you to search the cell libraries for a keyword to see if you can find cells that have that specific keyword in the name or description. So right now I searched for the word plan, and that's going to return a list of cells that have the word plan in the name or description. It's already found 20. And that searches every cell library that's in the MS cell list variable. You can, as you can see, uncheck certain libraries. So if I know that there's nothing in the alphabet library, the arrows library, I can uncheck that. And then it brings back what's sort of like a cell web page, where you can then, of course, click on a cell and place it. For some reason, it's at this weird angle. I bet my active angle got changed. Yep. For some reason, my active angle was changed, probably when I rotated that tree. So there you are. There's also the cell utility. The cell utility allows the user to globally manage an entire cell library instead of individual cells. It uses a tag to select which cells are to be manipulated by the tool command chosen. The user can tag all of the cells at once or select the cells individually by double-clicking on the cell name. And of course, what this does is it creates and prints into the active design file the sheets of tagged cells formatted for printing at 8.5 by 11. I'm not sure if that really has a good functionality that you'd necessarily be using on a regular basis, but be aware that that does exist. If you want to print out a bunch of cells on an 8.5 by 11 sheet, this utility has got you covered. There's also mirror cells or flip custom line styles. This can mirror cells or flip custom line styles. It kind of works like the mirror tool, except it also works on custom line styles. It changes the direction from which they were drawn. It's sort of redundant, but we leave it there because some people do use that because it's handy. And then randomly splatter cells. This can be useful for landscape applications. If there's a area that you want to randomly put shrubberies in, you can use the randomly splatter cells tool to do that. You can specify the scale and the quantity and splatter them. Now we did mention, of course, the cell apps menu, but if you notice on each of the discipline menus, it does include links to the cell library and the cell web pages. And what that does is it will actually attach the cell library to the cell dialog for you and open the cell dialog. So if it's not open, it will open it and attach that cell library. So if you're working in a specific discipline, that can be pretty handy. And then, of course, it's a shortcut directly to the cell web pages for that discipline. So each of these menus will have ITS, cell library, and cell web page, lighting, cell library, cell web page, signals, cell library, etc. So that's another thing that we've added to the menus just for your convenience. We mentioned dropping cells when we were talking about the drop tool. You can drop a cell. It's considered a complex element. If you have complex checked, you can just use that tool to drop that to basic geometry. Also, you'll notice here there's an option to drop shared cells to normal cell. I run into this occasionally with Sheet Navigator. Sheet Navigator does not work well with shared cells if you're using a shared cell sheet border. That's a little difficult to say. If you have a shared cell sheet border, Sheet Navigator will not read it. And so the solution is, of course, to make sure that, first of all, in the cell library, go to the cell library dialog and make sure that the used shared cells checkbox is unchecked. And then you'll go to your sheet border and select the drop shared cells to normal cell and then enter a data point on that sheet border, and that will convert the shared cell sheet border into a regular sheet border. Exercise 11.1. In exercise 11.1, we'll be working in the DSGN RDO1 file. That's in the roadway folder of your dataset. You should also be able to locate it on the recent files list on your file dropdown. Once you're in DSGN RDO1.dgn, we're going to attach a cell library. You can select from the Cell Apps menu, FDOT Cell Libraries. You can also select the Cell Library dialog from the primary toolbar. Right. Once you've opened the Cell Library dialog, we're going to select Attach File. Now, if you know what cell library you'd like to attach and it's in this list, you can go ahead and just attach it directly from the list. We're going to open up the DR plan cell, but I'd like to show you how to browse for it. So I'm going to select Attach File. Our cell libraries are located in the FDOT SS4 Resources Cell folder. This folder will be on your local drive if you have a standalone workstation. If, however, you have a client-server installation, this folder will be on the server. We're going to select the DR Plan Cell library and click Open. We've successfully attached the DR Plan Cell library. You can see all the cells here. If you double-click on any of these cells, it will become the active placement cell, and you can place that cell. Exercise 11.2, we're going to create a new cell library. So while still in the DSGN RDO1 and still with the Cell Library dialog open, select File, New, and that is going to immediately take us to the cell folder of our project. I mentioned this before, that this is where your custom project level cell libraries can exist. And it automatically takes us there because we are creating a cell library. We're going to call it Highway. Once you type in Highway, hit Save, it immediately attaches that brand new cell library, highway.cell. Highway.cell attached, we need to go ahead and create a cell to put in this cell library. You can either dock this cell library somewhere or move it off of the screen, or you can simply close it. We don't need it open just right now. I mean, it's attached to the file, so we don't have to worry about it. We are going to use the Find and Replace Text tool to locate the structure CR11. So edit, Find Replace Text. We're going to get rid of the values that are already in there and type in CR11. This is likely to be a GeoPack label, and those are cells, so make sure you check the In Cells checkbox. Hit Find. Alright, it is located CR11. And what we're looking at here is this structure right here, the green and purple. That is a curb cut ramp, and we're going to create a cell for curb cut ramps. Now, we don't have a lot of curb cut ramp cells because there's so many different types of curb cut ramps that it would be impractical to have a cell library full of all the different configurations. But in this instance, we're going to turn this curb cut ramp into a cell. Right press and select Turn Off Level by Element. And let's just get all of these extra lines out of the way. I could have turned off my reference files or any number of other things, but I'm just going to use the Turn Off Level by Element to get things out of the way, just so I can isolate this one curb cut ramp. The next step is to use the Element Selection tool to select all of the elements that make up this curb cut ramp. I'm going to set mine to Add, just so I can click around and keep clicking on things until everything is part of that selection set. Oop, there we go. I've selected all of those items. Now's the time you want to bring back up your cell library dialog. And from the Cell Tools, select Define Cell Origin. And we're going to place this cell origin right here on this line. You can put your cell origin wherever you'd like on this structure, depending on how you want to place it, but we're going to put the origin right here. And as soon as I do that, you notice the Create button in the dialog lights up. We're still in highway.cell. The Create button has lit up. I'm clicking the Create button. I'm going to call this Curb Cut and give it a description. It's a graphic cell. I'm going to hit Create, And now you see in our cell library is the curb cut ramp. Okay, and you see now it's attached to my cursor. I can place it as a cell. And you also notice that it places on the specific correct levels, the levels that it was originally designed on. That's because we don't have that relative box checked, so it places the multiple elements on the different levels that they belong on. Now, what about editing a cell? If I select Open for Editing, what's going to happen? I'll tell you what. It's going to open up the cell library like a DGN file. So what happens now is that the highway cell library has been opened up like a DGN file. It is, of course, a .cell file, but it has been opened up as a DGN. And we learned about models earlier. You'll notice it has a default model, and here's that curb cut that we're in right now. That's the model we're in right now. Every cell in a cell library is stored in its own model. For example, we could make a copy of this. Just like you can copy a model. We'll call this curb cut 12. And then we'll change something about it. Let's use that modify tool to just kind of move some. And in fact, let's use grid lock, because we can see the grid there. See how that's not letting me place anything anywhere except on the grid. Alright, so I've made some edits. And you see now we do have two models in there. So let's go back to DSG and RDO1 and just find some blank space here. And let's explore the cell library again. So let's select the attached file, highway cell, open that up, and sure enough, here's my other curb cut ramp. So now we have two curb cut ramps. So that's how you edit a cell library. You can open up a cell library like a DGN file, make copies of the models, go into the models and edit them, and that is editing a cell library. Alright, the final exercise in this chapter is this. Let's close that dialog, and we're going to stay in DSGN RDO1. We're going to select Cell Apps, Cell Web Pages. We're going to use the Cell Web Pages. Specifically, we are going to select Cell Web Pages, the Landscape Cell Library, which is located under Roadway. You can also find it right here, Landscape Cell Library. You're going to scroll down until you find the Luminaire Pole 4 Round Light Cell. These are alphabetically organized. Here we are, Luminaire Pole 4 Round Light. And simply click. It is attached to the cursor, and we're going to look for the section of the design that has the Washington Mutual building. All I need to do is do this, type in Washington, and that should be enough. Notice that the cell is still attached to my cursor. Alrighty, we found that. Okay, it's still attached to my cursor. It's not at the same angle. In fact, alright, so we're supposed to put this luminaire right here at the corner. Doesn't really line up exactly. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of, this would be when it would be convenient to use that place and rotate option. However, when you're placing the cell using the cell web pages, for whatever reason, it doesn't give you the option to place and rotate. So that's a little problematic. So I'm simply going to place that there, and then rotate my view. Okay. And then I'm going to select the rotate tool, and I'm going to select 3 points, select my item, select that, and select this, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball that. There, we've placed a cell, we've rotated a cell. You've seen how the rotation tool works on cells. And that is the end of Chapter 11, Cells.